Every day, thousands of aircraft cross the sky, tracked by radar and guided by satellites, while controllers watch every movement from the ground. Modern aviation is built so nothing should vanish. Yet one night in March, the impossible happened. A commercial aircraft carrying nearly 240 people disappeared without a distress call, leaving a mystery that still haunts the world today. On the 8th of March in the year 2014, something happened that should have been impossible. A commercial aircraft carrying 239 people simply ceased to exist. Not in a single catastrophic moment captured by witnesses. Not in a way that provided answers. Instead, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 disappeared into a void so complete that a decade later, we are no closer to understanding what truly happened during those final hours above the Indian Ocean. This is not merely a story of a missing plane. This is an investigation into one of aviation's most profound mysteries, a case that challenges everything we thought we knew about modern aircraft and digital surveillance. It is a story about the limits of technology and the haunting questions that remain when all the data points to possibilities too difficult to contemplate. The story begins with routine. On the evening of March the 7th, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 was scheduled to depart Kuala Lumpur International Airport at 11:35 in the evening, with arrival in Beijing expected just after 5 in the morning. It was among the most routine of aviation routes, flown countless times with the reliability that modern air travel has come to promise. The captain commanding the aircraft was Zahari Ahmad Shah, a 53-year-old pilot with more than 18,000 hours of flight experience. By any measure, he was supremely qualified. He had been with Malaysia Airlines for more than 3 decades. His reputation was exemplary. Colleagues described him as professional and meticulous. Yet beneath the surface of this ordinary professional existed something more complicated. Zahari maintained an intense interest in flight simulators. He owned a sophisticated home flight simulator that he had painstakingly constructed in his residence. He spent considerable time practicing procedures, running simulations of various scenarios. Beside him was Farik Abdul Hamid, a 27-year-old first officer with over 6,000 hours of flight experience. Farik was capable and conscientious. The passengers boarding that night represented a cross-section of humanity traveling for countless mundane reasons: business travelers, families, students, tourists, 239 people hailing from 15 different nations. The aircraft itself was a Boeing 777-200, a twin-engine wide-body jet that had been in service for nearly 13 years. It was a masterpiece of aviation engineering, equipped with redundant systems layered upon redundant systems. Every critical function was backed up by independent alternatives. The aircraft was fully airworthy. All maintenance was current. There was no indication that anything was amiss. At 11:35 in the evening, MH370 pushed back from the gate. Everything proceeded according to protocol. The aircraft climbed steadily toward its cruising altitude. Controllers tracked the departure on radar. Nothing suggested that anything was anything less than textbook normal. 20 minutes after departure, as the aircraft approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, the moment arrived that would transform everything. At 1:19 in the morning, the pilots were instructed to switch radio frequencies from Malaysian control to Vietnamese control. This was standard procedure, executed hundreds of thousands of times every year. Captain Zahari transmitted a brief radio message. His voice was calm and professional. He said, "Good night, Malaysian 370. These were the last words that would ever be heard from anyone aboard the aircraft. These were the final human communications, the last acoustic evidence that the aircraft existed and was functioning normally. What happened next would occupy investigators for years. The aircraft was not handed off to Vietnamese control as expected. Instead, something occurred that caused the aircraft's radio to cease transmitting. The pilots never made contact with the new frequency. When the Vietnamese controller looked for the aircraft on his radar, it was not where it should have been. Where there should have been a radar target representing Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, there was instead nothing but empty sky. For a few moments, controllers assumed the pilots had simply failed to change frequency properly. But as seconds became minutes, the absence became increasingly alarming. The aircraft should have appeared on the Vietnamese radar almost immediately. It did not. The aircraft should have transmitted a recognition message. It did not. At Malaysian Air Traffic Control, the staff understood that something was deeply wrong. The aircraft was missing. Not missing in the sense that it could not be located physically, but missing in the sense that it was no longer responding to radio calls. This was not supposed to happen. This was not something that happened to well-maintained aircraft operated by experienced pilots on routine flights in a well-controlled airspace. What made this moment even more extraordinary was what happened to the aircraft's radar signature. Modern commercial aircraft are equipped with devices called transponders. These devices constantly broadcast information about the aircraft's position, altitude, speed, and identification. They are active, continuous transmitters that announce the aircraft's presence to every radar facility in range. The transponder is the aircraft's electronic voice in the sky. But both transponders on Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 ceased transmitting at almost precisely the same moment. This was extraordinarily significant because both transponders failing simultaneously is something that happens with a probability so low as to be almost incomprehensible. The two transponders operate on completely independent electrical systems. They are not connected to one another in any way that would allow a single failure to disable both. For both to fail at the same moment would require either multiple independent failures happening in perfect synchronization or something far more deliberate. Even more significant was what happened to the aircraft's radar signal itself. The aircraft had been steadily visible on Malaysian military radar as it climbed to altitude. Military radar operates on a different frequency than civilian radar and is not dependent on the transponder broadcasts. When the civilian transponders ceased transmitting, the military radar continued to track the aircraft. And then the radar target simply changed direction, sharply, decisively, dramatically. The aircraft, which had been flying on a northeastward heading toward Beijing, suddenly turned. The radar target began moving in a completely different direction. It was as if someone in the flight deck had made a deliberate decision to change course. Not a gentle turn, not a gradual heading change, a sharp alteration in flight path that suggested purposeful control of the aircraft. This moment of direction change is critical because it places the decision to alter course at the exact moment when radio communication was severed and the transponders were disabled. Whatever happened to the aircraft happened at the moment when all outside communication was terminated. The aircraft began climbing to 43,000 feet, higher than its planned cruising altitude. Then, the radar target began weaving across the Malaysian peninsula, executing what appeared to be evasive maneuvers designed to avoid detection. Within minutes, the aircraft disappeared from Malaysian military radar as well. It had flown beyond the range of Malaysian radar facilities, crossing over Thailand into airspace, where no continuous surveillance was available. The aircraft had entered a coverage gap and disappeared from surveillance completely. For the next 40 minutes, nothing. No radar signal, no radio transmission, no transponder indication. To outside observers scrambling to understand what had happened, the aircraft had simply ceased to exist. What was happening in those dark minutes in the flight deck remains absolutely unknown. Were both pilots incapacitated? Had someone else taken control? Had they collided with terrain and crashed? These questions swirled in the minds of investigators, and to this day, they remain fundamentally unanswered. The next crucial piece of evidence emerged only after weeks of investigation, when authorities gained access to the aircraft's flight simulator located at Zaheri's residence. They discovered something that would ignite intense speculation. The simulator had been used just days before the flight to practice a procedure. It was a peculiar procedure to practice. It was a simulation of an engine failure during a climb at precisely the altitude where the real aircraft had been flying when it disappeared. But that was not the most significant finding. The simulator had been used to simulate what happens when the aircraft's transponder is disabled during an engine failure scenario. The simulation explored what would happen if the communication systems and the transponder were shut down while the aircraft continued flying. This was not normal pilot training. This was not part of any standard airline curriculum. This was an investigation into a very specific set of circumstances that an ordinary pilot would have no professional reason to explore. Investigators examined the flight data saved on the simulator's hard drive. They discovered practice sessions that modeled a flight path very similar to the one the missing aircraft had taken during its final hours. A route that began over the South China Sea, turned sharply over Malaysia, and then continued westward out across the Strait of Malacca and over the Indian Ocean. This was not a coincidence that could be easily dismissed. The implications were deeply troubling. If the captain had been practicing this scenario repeatedly, if he had been rehearsing the exact sequence of disabling the transponder and the communication systems at the moment when an engine supposedly failed, then the obvious question arose unbidden. Had he actually practiced this scenario not merely in simulation, but in reality? Had the flight simulator been a rehearsal for what actually unfolded on the night of March 8th? Yet the evidence was not so clear as to permit certainty. The evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive. It was suspicious, but not definitive. Aviation experts were divided. Some suggested that any pilot with deep curiosity about aircraft systems might practice such scenarios. Others argued that practicing the specific sequence of disabling both communications and transponders at the moment of engine failure was so unusual, so specifically targeted toward hiding the aircraft, that it could only be interpreted as rehearsal for deliberate action. As time progressed, the focus began to shift from Malaysian airspace to the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean that lay beyond. The aircraft had been in the air for more than 40 minutes after it disappeared from radar. It did not simply crash immediately. It continued flying. It continued being controlled. It continued moving through the sky. How was this known? Because the aircraft continued to exist electronically even after it had disappeared from radar. The Boeing 777 is equipped with a system called Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. This system works by having the aircraft broadcast its own position and other data automatically and continuously. The aircraft announces itself to the world. But this system can be disabled. The transponder can be turned off. However, the aircraft continues to communicate in other ways. One such system is the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, known as ACARS. This system automatically sends information about the aircraft's condition, performance, and location to the airline's operations center on the ground. It is a continuous stream of information being transmitted automatically without requiring pilot action. But ACRs can be disabled. The system can be turned off manually or through a circuit breaker. When the aircraft disappeared from radar, the ACR's transmissions also ceased. They stopped abruptly, which suggested that someone had deliberately disabled the system. Yet, despite the cessation of ACARS transmissions, the aircraft was not invisible to all surveillance. The Inmarsat satellite system, which provides maritime and aviation telecommunications across vast ocean regions, was listening. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 had an Inmarsat satellite phone registered on the aircraft. This device was not actively being used, but because it was connected to the aircraft's systems, it maintained a connection with the Inmarsat satellite. That connection, even when no data or voice communications were being actively transmitted, created something called a handshake. A handshake is a brief electronic signal that occurs when a device checks in with its communications network. The aircraft's Inmarsat system would periodically attempt to establish contact with the satellite, sending a signal that announced its presence. These check-ins happened at regular intervals. These handshakes contained critical information. They contained the power level of the signal being transmitted from the aircraft. They contained timing data that indicated when the aircraft's systems were powered on and operational. And more importantly, they contained information about which Inmarsat satellite the aircraft was communicating with, which could be used to calculate the aircraft's location based on how far the signal had to travel. Over the next 7 hours, the Inmarsat satellite recorded handshakes from the aircraft. Every hour, sometimes more frequently, the aircraft sent these signals. They showed that the aircraft was still flying. They showed that the aircraft's electrical systems were still operational. They showed that the aircraft was still announcing its presence. By analyzing the signal strength and the timing of these handshakes, investigators were able to determine something about the aircraft's general location. The signals indicated that the aircraft was somewhere in a vast arc that extended across the southern Indian Ocean. But these signals also provided another critical piece of information. By examining the signal strength and the handshake timing, investigators determined that the aircraft had flown southwestward after disappearing from Malaysian radar. It had crossed the Strait of Malacca and continued out over the Indian Ocean. Rather than heading toward Beijing, it was heading toward the vast emptiness of the open ocean. This revelation transformed the investigation entirely. The aircraft had not crashed in Thailand or Malaysia. It had been deliberately flown away from populated areas. It had been deliberately directed across the Indian Ocean toward a region where it would be extremely unlikely to be discovered. Someone had command of the aircraft and was flying it with purpose. The aircraft eventually crashed into the Indian Ocean. This was confirmed by analysis of the fuel remaining, the final handshake signals, and later by the discovery of wreckage on shores surrounding the Indian Ocean. Pieces of the aircraft's wing were found on beaches in Tanzania. Pieces of the stabilizer were found near the coast of Mozambique. Other fragments arrived on shores in Madagascar and Comoros. But the central mysteries remained unsolved. What had caused the aircraft to change direction? Who had disabled the transponder and the communication systems? Why had the aircraft been flown toward the desolate Indian Ocean? What was the sequence of events in the flight deck during those critical minutes? One theory proposed that one or both pilots had taken deliberate action. The evidence of the simulator practice showed that scenarios involving disabled communication systems and altered flight paths had been recently rehearsed. The timing of the course change coincided perfectly with the loss of all external communication. The aircraft was flown in a way that suggested familiarity with the aircraft's systems and capabilities. Another theory proposed that the aircraft had experienced a catastrophic decompression event. If the cabin had suddenly lost pressure, everyone in the passenger cabin would have experienced severe hypoxia within minutes. But if the flight deck had remained pressurized, the pilot in the flight deck would have remained conscious. This pilot could have then flown the aircraft toward the Indian Ocean, having disabled all communication to prevent anyone on the ground from discovering what had occurred. Yet another theory suggested that the aircraft had experienced mechanical failure that had disabled the communication systems. But the evidence made this seem unlikely. The aircraft continued to fly for more than 7 hours after the communication systems failed. If it had experienced catastrophic electrical failure, it would have crashed much sooner. The fact that the aircraft continued flying in a controlled manner suggested that the flight control systems remained operational. The reality was that despite the extensive investigation, despite the analysis of vast amounts of data, Despite the recovery of physical wreckage, the central mystery remained unsolved. The world's experts could not reach a consensus on what had actually happened to Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 during those final hours. Years have passed since the night of March 8th. The search operations have long since concluded. The investigation has produced extensive reports analyzing the available evidence and exploring the possible scenarios. The families of those on the aircraft continue to live with the profound uncertainty of never knowing what actually happened to their loved ones. What remains certain is this: at 1:19 in the morning on March 8th, 2014, an aircraft carrying 239 people ceased to communicate with the world. At that moment, every person on that aircraft was severed from all connection to the human world they had known. They were at altitude over the South China Sea, trusting in the skill of their pilots and the integrity of their aircraft. None of them knew that their world was about to change forever. What happened in the minutes and hours that followed remains one of aviation's greatest mysteries. The question hangs over the investigation like an unresolved chord in a symphony. It demands resolution that the available evidence seems unable to provide. The data points in multiple directions, the theories proliferate, the certainty remains elusive. In the end, what we know is only fragments. We know the aircraft was in the air at 1:19. We know it was not where it should have been 5 minutes later. We know it continued flying across the Indian Ocean for more than 7 hours. We know it eventually crashed and sank into the depths of the ocean. We know that 239 people were aboard that aircraft, and their location and their ultimate fate remain unknown to this day. The modern world is one of constant surveillance, continuous tracking, perpetual observation. We have satellites in the sky watching our every movement. We have radar stations covering our airspace. We have aircraft equipped with redundant systems designed to prevent catastrophe. Yet on that night, all of this technology proved insufficient. An aircraft carrying nearly 240 human beings simply vanished into the darkness, and the world was left with questions it could not answer. What happened to Malaysia Airlines Flight 370? Perhaps one day, new evidence will emerge. Perhaps new technology will allow us to peer into the depths of the Indian Ocean and finally locate the aircraft's wreckage and its flight data recorders. Perhaps someone will come forward with knowledge they have long harbored in silence. Perhaps the mystery will yield to investigation and analysis, and the truth will finally be revealed. But for now, the aircraft remains missing. The mystery remains unsolved. And somewhere in the depths of the Indian Ocean, the truth rests in darkness, waiting perhaps for eternity for someone to find it and bring it back into the light.